Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Sivamohan Vallavan. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Warwick in Sociology, and I will try to do for you today a basic taster lecture. Obviously, we're in really bizarre circumstances, so first and foremost, my thoughts to you and your family as regards your safety and well-being. I will start with some attempt any case at some basic definitions. They will be a little scattered, but just something that will give us a base to work from. So by consumerism, I just mean a historic shift in our economic behavior. Never before in human history, and it's not controversial to say so, it'll be very apparent to you as well, but never before in human history have we engaged in this volume and frequency of purchases of consumer goods like shoes and jackets and things of that sort, or actually experiences. By experiences, I mean the frequency with which we go to restaurants, visit or frequent cafes, go off on holidays, or even more bespoke things like go on a go away excursion or go to an escape room or other such things that we might be able to buy as an experience. Now, the crucial distinction here is that historically we've often found that most economic activity related to buying things that had an immediate use. This is called the use value of things. That we buy it because it has a material function that addresses some particular need, either related to health, nutrition, maybe even a basic sense of well-being, shelter, housing, and our other day-to-day necessities. Consumerism, on the other hand, is about purchasing things that are superfluous. I know that sounds like a really fancy word, but essentially means excessive to our actual needs, well beyond the basic subsistence of how we ought to, or how we would otherwise necessarily, how we would have to live. Of course, we should already pause and say for many people in this world, they don't have the means to engage in consumer activity. In fact, they live in scarcity. So already we see something interesting. For some people in this world, a not insignificant volume of people, they are able to engage in extraordinary amount of purchases which attends to all their excess desires. Whilst for other people living in that same society or living in that same world, they in fact experience scarcity. So we have abundance in one part of the world, or for one half of the world, probably less than half, but nonetheless, an abundance where they're able to express themselves through consumer behavior, and for another significant portion of this world, scarcity. So already we see a tension that is sociologically interesting. But in a more historic sense, this is what we conceptualize as the move from a use-based society to a desire-based society. So suddenly our relationship to products and purchases becomes less about what it does for us in terms of its manifest function in its utilitarian sense, but what it does to ourselves, to our sense of psyche, to our sense of selfhood, to our sense of identity. Put differently, consumer objects, consumer experiences start to do a different kind of work. They appeal to our desires. They appeal to our desires and also our anxieties. This will, of course, seem incredibly banal and obvious to you, but it is worth pausing here. It is not a self-explanatory fact that we would in fact want to buy things that we don't in actuality need. Now, there's a little example I used in the original Open Days, which some of you might remember, but hopefully I will just recapitulate them for those who haven't heard it before. But just think about the very elementary facts of our social lives or economic lives. We all have many of us in any case, have multiple pairs of shoes. But if you just take a historical pause, it isn't at all clear why you would actually need or even desire all those shoes. So in early capitalism, it was quite straightforward that once somebody had shoes, they were very unlikely to buy another pair of shoes. In fact, they would be mystified that there would be any cause to buy another pair of shoes. But so something is actually gives way, we believe, in the culture of capitalism, or a culture arises that allows capitalism to expand, to become a much more fully embedded, fully fledged economic system in which we live and try to establish ourselves. So in this transition, what happens is that actually the shoe itself ceases to be something that just relates to us in terms of its use function or its manifest function. So it's no longer just something that protects your feet from the concrete and the hard elements and gives you, it brings you a degree of bodily comfort, but rather something transformative happens, what Raymond Williams calls the magic of modernity, the magic of commercial modernity. And commercial modernity says that the shoe itself is no longer something that you should approach with or reckon with as simply a material thing, but you must see, or you will find, symbolic meaning in shoes and the various ways in which shoes and similar products in any domain can be distinguished. So shoes cease to be something that we relate to in terms of what it does for us, but we instead reckon with it as something that gives us meaning, symbolic meaning. So suddenly it's about our social status, it's about our peer group, it is about our sense of aspiration, it's about our sense of attitude or aesthetics even, it's about a sense of individuality. What else can it be? It's about even, it can be about respectability. Certain shoes convey that, other shoes convey a more youthful street identity, whatever it may be. But shoes suddenly are invested with symbolic meaning. And it is that symbolic meaning that sociologists argue is what becomes relevant to most of our economic activity. We buy things because it starts to say something about ourselves, our very understanding of how it is we want to express an individuality, a sense of identity, a sense of personality. It even prays and targets our fears, our sense of inadequacy, our sense of anxiety. Of course, these are not necessarily just shoes, but in terms of the broader sphere of consumer objects and experiences, we start to develop a desire, because it is no longer a desire for the product, it is a desire for its symbolic relevance, its meaning. And again, to just stress the great historical leap that these things aren't a given, that they aren't just ready-made, obvious social facts, but they actually belong to particular kind of histories that have changed who we are and have become part of our contemporary lives. So I want you to think about Henry Ford, just briefly. It'll be a strange example, but I think it's clarificatory. So in the early 20th century, you have a guy called Henry Ford, who is, of course, associated with what the company we now understand to be Ford. It was the first real mega company in the automobile industry. In fact, Ford was central for developing a whole assortment of industrial manufacturing methods which allowed for mass production and allowed for certain fairly complex goods to be available at reasonably affordable rates. The assembly line structure of factories which allowed for mass production. And the car he is particularly associated with is the Model T Ford, a particular car. But what was interesting about Ford is that here he was presiding over this extraordinary takeover of a new market, and over which he had greatly enriched himself. Indeed, later on, this influence and power leads to him actually pursuing some interesting and problematic political directions, a certain form of an attempt to develop the American equivalent of a Nazi party. But what is also interesting about Ford is that he himself still thought we were living in a need-based society. So all he understood his cars as doing was giving people an object or a good that allowed them to put that good to use, so put that car to use. So he has this famous line that is still very telling, where he goes, "You can have any car that you like of mine as long as it's black." So he saw no reason to differentiate his cars. They were just cars, and they will do what they do, and they're reasonably affordable, and they're sufficiently functional for you to purchase them. Interestingly, General Motors, which is emerges as another giant in the car industry, has a guy called Sloan, a PR guru, a marketing guru, a design guru within the company. And he immediately spots the inadequacy of the Fordist approach. He realized that, in fact, what you ought to be doing is not selling a product, but selling a lifestyle. trying to target your product in alignment with the kind of sets of desires that you might be able to invite in particular demographics. So he argued that all you had to do was change the car a little bit, give it different colors, change the headlights, change the design in fairly innocuous ways that really have make no real material difference to what the car does, and the car would ordinarily see to you anyways. But through these innovations, through these interventions, through this ability to market the car as something else, about lifestyle, about your sense of status, about even your aspirations, then the car speaks to a different type of psyche in the human and the human within modernity. As the great cultural theorist, a guy called Herbert Marcuse, who has a fantastic book, if you have the time, called One-Dimensional Man. But he argues that, and the quote follows, that modern man sees his soul reflected in the shine of his car. And here we see a very different dynamic emerging. This is a historical break that becomes so entrenched throughout the 20th century and particularly advanced in the 21st century, that we are no longer in need-based societies, and many people are able to partake in consumer activity where they buy excess goods and tire of the goods that they already have because they no longer relate to it on the material terms, but it's now on a premise of desire as an expression of individuality, personality, and freedom. And if you want to be even more elaborate about the analytic consequences of this, you can go to a guy called Theodor Adorno. So he calls this the great illusion of freedom in modernity. So everyone, we want to be free, we want to be individuals. But modernity actually, in many sense, restricts our freedoms. But what it does do is allow you to simulate a sense of freedom, simulate a sense of individuality and differentiation through your consumer practices. So this is what he calls pseudo-individuality, a very interesting concept where modernity promises freedom in the full sense of a full cultural development of a living lives free of alienation. But in fact, it cannot deliver it because the argument is premised that is actually modernity is still tied on basic hierarchies and basic structures of class antagonisms or economic inequalities. So what it can actually give you is not actual freedom, but a simulated freedom, and with a simulation that lives through pseudo micro distinctions in consumer formats. And so one interesting way sociologically of thinking about it is the difference between the manifest function and the latent function. The manifest function is what it does. The latent function is what is implied, what are its associations, what does it do for our sense of self. And what we have argued throughout this lecture, though I'm dithering and I'm sure I'll meander and digress all the time. But if we see in the themes of this lecture, what has happened is that the manifest function has become less and less important, and it's the latent function that establishes market value, and it's a latent function that governs how we engage in our consumer activities and purchases. Now, a major concept that therein arises is an old concept proposed by Marx, but has had many, many different iterations throughout the social sciences, but also sociology. And it's called commodity fetishism. And commodity fetishism is trying to tell us about the hidden violence of this extraordinary shift from manifest to latent, from material to desire, from subsistence to excess purchasing, superfluous purchasing. So commodity fetishism, now it's probably a bad idea to ever talk to young people about what a fetish is, and it's ill-advised. But I actually don't want you to think about it in the terms that a fetish is usually considered in everyday parlance. The original understanding of what a fetish is, and that's why Marx is using his term, commodity fetishism, the ordinary understanding of fetish, and actually, if to be honest, even our sexual understandings of it has some relationship to what Marx is trying to say. A fetish ultimately just means where the part overrides the whole. So you can only see the part and you can no longer see the whole. the entirety. And what does that mean? If you don't mind, I will loosely allude to the sexual parameters because I think it's clarificatory. So many people talk about, in derisory terms. I don't want to get involved in any of this and anything judgmental, but, let us say somebody has a foot fetish. And what this means is why this invites laughter, or why this often invites, popular reproach, is that foot fetish means you can no longer see the entirety of the individual, the entirety of the sexual possibility, or the entirety of the individual personality, but rather you only see the foot. The foot overrides the entirety. The part flattens the whole. And this is what Marx is also talking about with commodity fetishism. In commodity fetishism, we only see the symbolic value of the product. We only see its values, its so-called ethos, its so-called associations. We forget that the product actually does something. And we forget that the product is actually a thing that is sold. And what we really forget as a result is that people have worked. There is labor involved in the making of this product. So commodity fetishism means we only see the commodity, the surface value, what it conveys in the marketplace, in the consumer market. And that is the fetish because it hides, it flattens, it overrides the underlying reality of what that product is. And that product fundamentally is something that people have worked on. People have been paid, often a pittance, and often in very oppressive and dehumanizing circumstances to make that product. So as this slide says, the labor expended on the production is hidden so that the consumer sees an object as that which they want, not a product of someone else's labor. So this connection to labor gets riven, gets torn asunder, gets lost. And this is crucial from a socioeconomic justice perspective, or from an equality perspective, or even from just an analytic perspective of how we just in ordinary terms understand what a product actually is. Put in more critical terms, what it argues is that the very reality of labor exploitation gets lost or gets forgotten. We no longer see that level of exploitation. We only see the product and its symbolic exchange value. So now, as we near the end of this lecture, I'm really sorry about all my meandering tangents, digressions. Alas, this is my nature. But we are, in fact, nearing the end of the lecture, and thank you for bearing with me, particularly with how disjointed and stilted this format is. It's still taking me some time to adjust to what this all entails. But we are nearing the end. And I just want to address here a certain suspicion some of you might be harboring. So I think many of you, the younger people amongst you, will understandably, more or less generally agree with the basic parameters of what I've sketched, this perspective I've tried to communicate to you. But you will also be a little cynical. You will also be a little critical about the historical validity of this. You will perhaps suspect or presume that much of what I've said is a little anachronistic, that it really only applies to the 20th century, that post-war era, the 90s era perhaps, but certainly not this digital era. And the lives you have lived as what they call digital native, that your generation has always grown up with the internet and all its niche casting, might encourage you to think that what I'm really talking about is mass society, mass advertising, and in many senses, you might presume that you are exempted from some of these mechanisms. And in some senses, you're right. You are right. There is a dramatic shift, and we need to attend to that. But I would argue, or certainly some of my colleagues would argue, that in fact, you are much more embedded precisely because of the shifts in digital technology and all the affordances it allows for as regards advertising and marketing, that you are in actuality far more ensconced, far more nestled into the specific, more streamlined techniques which advertising can today deploy. So let me explain this to you in three different ways, really. So one, it is simply about what kind of ads come to you. Remember that for your parents' generation, indeed my own generation, if I'm actually of that age in all likelihood, alas, and alas. But for us, in many instances, much of advertising was wasted. There was only few outlets for advertising. You'll be watching one of the 3 channels that you have, one of the 5, 10 channels that you have, and most of the advertising was entirely irrelevant. It would be about bathroom tiles, but you have no reason or no opportunity even to redecorate your bathroom tiles. You've just bought a couch, you don't need another couch, so on. But what actually happens is that in the previous era, much advertising was wasted because it wasn't actually targeted to you. It was actually trying to target itself to a generic mass. So all these assumptions about individuality that we nurture and we harbor, it gets flattened, and therein the advertising gets lost on you. It doesn't speak to that symbolic attachment to the specificity of you, your social location, your peer group, your status aspirations, or your social identity. And the second hiccup or the second gap was that even if advertising came to you, you were not able to engineer that purchase. Why? Because purchasing happens on the high street. So somehow you might be watching the TV, the advertising might flicker across your screen, but it cannot move you to the high street. And by the time that you are on the high street that Saturday afternoon when you're attending to your weekly shopping, all those thoughts are fairly distant. All that advertising, razzmatazz, and sensation feels distant, doesn't even occur to you at the forefront of your thoughts. Now, 2 things have happened under digital techniques, through digital affordances. What transpires is that now most of your advertising is targeted to you, either through algorithmic data about your own purchasing habits. And of course, own purchasing habits already suggest a commitment or a taste geared towards that product field. So if you bought one item from a particular outlet, of course, in all likelihood, you'll be interested in another item from said outlet. Secondly, the advertising tails you wherever you go in your digital life. So you might be just reading a normal news article, or you'll be trying to attend to some minor cultural taste of yours. But there on the borders, in the margins, and flickering in and out and kind of surfacing in unexpected dimensions is fundamentally your previous consumer habits and purchasing habits, because of that algorithmic archiving and residual data that it has at its disposal about your particular vagaries, your particular preferences, or your particular needs, desires, and anxieties. Secondly, it also pulls your data through a broader peer group understanding of who you are. So whilst you might not have bought from a particular place, people in your relevant social networks or in your relevant field of social interactions are, however, interested in or have partaken in certain consumer habits. And of course, if your close peer or someone of a similar social location has been somewhat interested in a particular product or brand, it is right to presume that you too might be similarly congenial or vulnerable to that particular product. So there is what we would call a much more niche, targeted, streamlined advertising techniques that is available in contemporary digital media eras that allows advertising is very dynamic and sharpened vectors, if you like, in terms of how it captures the social field or different demographics. Secondly, in terms of the problem of actually doing the buying, now the digital purchase is merely a click away. So this, even if you can put down your favorites and your wish list and so on, even that is a kind of archiving of a possibility of purchases happening in increasingly frequent and instantaneous modes, which is very different to the temporal gap, as we used to argue, the temporal gap, the gap in time between the advertising sensation and how it taps into a desiring ethos and the actual possibility of purchasing. So those are 2 key dynamics which are more applicable to you, which situate you in a much more entrenched way than it did, in fact, previous generations. But there's also a third factor, and this is the matter of personalized intermediaries. All across the advertising era, there has been a collective distance between our identification with the corporation or the product. Why? Because we have an inbuilt or political suspicion of the corporate power, the corporate influence. However, in this newer era, what has occurred is that a series of intermediaries who actually present to you their personality. By this I mean all the vloggers, all the shopping hall, all the kind of DIY, bespoke, personalized characters in our digital sphere who also talk about shopping and also link themselves to the fields of products. And what's interesting is they allow for a gap between the corporate sphere, the sphere of advertising, the sphere of consumer production, and to the sphere of consumers, the sphere of individualized recipients of the desire to consume. And so these intermediaries become a crucial bridging which detoxifies some of our inbuilt suspicions of corporate messaging. So I know this is going to be terribly dated. Again, I'm showing my age, but the figure that comes to mind for me is, of course, Zoella. And Zoella, I don't know if she's at all relevant anymore, but she was, in a particular moment when we were trying to do consumer theorization of digital lives, she was in fact quite a figurehead, quite an emblematic exemplar of this new world that was emerging. Because what was really interesting with Zoella, I don't know if you know her, but I've linked one of these inordinate number of videos that she has available. Very lucrative, I gather, her YouTube profile or her social media profile. And what Zoella is interesting is because she presents herself as the personality. You are tied to her by you identifying with her own sense of individuality, her own kind of identity that she has carved, and somehow it resonates with you. And what she does is she's very giddy, those hello, hello, and, a very energetic profile, very energetic habits. There's already a kind of personalized invitation to empathize or at least identify with that zeal and effervescence that she commands. And she also gives it a much more searching depth, because she often talks about, interspersed between these shopping hall evaluation comments, is also very personalized reflections on her own lives. So she, from what I understand, she would talk very sincerely about her own struggles with things like depression or mental health struggles and other social anxieties. And that is quite interesting because it is creating a different kind of affinity between the individual and their own desires and anxieties and fears to the intermediary, but via the intermediary, the YouTube character, the social media character, it opens up, it prizes open an entry into a whole field of products. Because what Zoella is ultimately doing is not necessarily telling you to buy one product over the other, though that too. What she's ultimately doing, when we take a deeper or longer, more distant analytic view, is that she's actually normalizing just shopping as mattering to our lives. That it is something we do, that it is something we ought to do, and it is something we should take seriously and be discerning and discriminatory about. And that's what capitalism fundamentally cares about. Capitalism does not really, is not particularly concerned, when you think of it as one mode of production, one big system, economic system. It doesn't really care where you buy from, ultimately. Individual companies care where you buy from, but seen as a collective, it is not at all concerned where you buy from. The only thing that matters is that you buy, and that you will buy again, and that you will buy more, irrespective of what it is you already have, irrespective of that if their products actually attend to some pressing subsistence manifest need. Instead, it simply needs you to buy and buy again. And that is the fascinating feature of contemporary, indirect, implicit, ambivalent advertising that happens on digital media through these figures. And you probably know more than me, so I don't want to presume too much. So I'm not entirely sure how often she gets actually paid by these, these companies and so on. But not even if she wasn't paid, though I understand she is, even if she wasn't paid, she's still normalizing the appetite for consumer desires through shopping without it having that slightly distant, robotic feel of corporate advertising, and it's much more interested in that very individualized, personalized, affectionate sense of how we relate to a field of products or to the very act of shopping and the necessity of shopping. And so where I want to end, in fact, is actually on a quite comical note, insofar as I'm not saying I am funny, but it is more the very status of the term is considered to be funny, and that's the hipster. Now, the hipster is a widely parodied, quite meaningless term. No one really knows what it, you can't quite nail it, and it's only used generally for pejorative purposes. It's usually used as a slur. No one conscientiously or deliberately styles themselves as a hipster, but it's often used as a term to deride something or another. But there is this amazing essay by Mark Grafe called When Was the Hipster? And what he argues is that let's not parody the hipster and think of it actually as a modern condition that is applicable to all of us, or at least emergent generations. And the hipster does one thing only, under his terms. What is interesting about the hipster is that they actually are honest and frank and candid about the fact that shopping matters. The field of consumer experience and objects that we purchase matters. It is, in fact, an expression of self, and therefore we have to take it seriously. So what they do is something called micro-connoisseurship. They start distinguishing between all the small details about different products. So whilst before we might have distinguished between the merits of different literatures, different political competing philosophies and ideologies, now we get caught up in the micro-connoisseurship of fundamentally quite meaningless distinctions in the world of products. Just like Adorno, which I mentioned a long time ago, when he was talking about pseudo-differentiation and pseudo-individualization, the hipster is the one that gives it its most fully formed philosophical expression. Why? Because things like even coffee beans, people will know all the micro detail about which coffee bean is better and how it complements this and that and how it is sourced and so on and so forth. So it no longer suffices just to say, instant coffee does the trick. No. Now you got to know whether this particular coffee kernel or coffee kernel is from coffee kernel or bean rather is whether it was nested in the excrement of a rare squirrel species, or whether it emerged from a particular kind of it was treated along a particular process that allows for its distinctive bitterness suffused by a coat of oakiness. I know I'm just talking nonsense. I really don't know how the particular terminology here, but it is interesting that is what hipsterdom does. It says that there are differences in these products and we need to take those differences seriously, or at least presume there are differences and therein commit to those differences as the basis of our very expression of self, individuality, freedom, and personality and identity. That's an extraordinary escalation from the starting point of our relationship to consumer life. The starting point is just buy because it attends to a basic subsistence need. Now we leap fully into the realm of all the symbolic meanings about how consumer purchases and products say something about us, how it is actually a vehicle or vessel for us to be somebody individual. Many of us are, of course, critical about this. We believe it's very thin, and it ties you into actually what are just market and capitalist structures in a very defeating and what shall we say, hollow manner. And it also prevents us or obstructs an understanding of the labor costs, the exploitations that are also so central to that very infrastructure. But nonetheless, that is what the hipster does. It takes it to its logical conclusion. It takes it to its end scenario, the end scenario which many of us currently inhabit, and which seems likely to accelerate the more and more we get embedded in consumer possibilities and the digital mediation of those possibilities and the meaning of those possibilities. Let me just finish then, because I'm talking a lot now, but I'm getting carried away, as you can see. But I don't know, you can stop the video whenever you like, and it's about to end anyhow. But let me just say, reiterate the core point here that I think quite important, and I think is often misunderstood. Capitalism, as a broader system of production, does not care where you buy from. It only wants you to buy more. And we often think that capitalism is actually about buying from corporations. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter where you buy from. It just is about repeating your purchases habit at an accelerated frequency, so the market can always grow. Because capitalism is always tied to this infinite sense of growth. That growth is dependent on us wanting to buy more, that us wanting to partake more and more in that very market activity. So it's not actually about buying from Nike or Amazon or Starbucks, though it is that too. It is actually just buying anywhere, buying from a charity shop, buying from eBay, buying some from a vintage store, buying from an independent brewery, buying from a kind of, a bespoke little snazzy family humble cafe. It doesn't matter. It is simply about buying more, and on the basis that what you bought was not actually required in the first place, and you didn't even know you didn't even know you desired that before you were brought into the realm of sensations, which advertising and this great consumer culture can invite in you. To be entirely nonsensical again, as is my wont, I never knew I wanted beans nested in squirrel excrement, but there we are. Suddenly we're of the opinion that perhaps that is something I ought to try. Wouldn't that be a nice novelty? Wouldn't that prove that I'm actually a quite experimental, refined, or at least inquisitive person? So I am so sorry about the length of this lecture, and I am so ever so grateful for you having joined us. I hope it is somewhat interesting. Again, I don't think the current situation allows for a particularly interesting, and yeah, we would like to be much more interactive, allow you to pose your questions. And that's ideally how university will be when you do come to us at Warwick. Hopefully you will come to us, but even any other university, hopefully that will be your sociological experience of how the classroom works, that the lecture can be engaging, and how we can take just minor features of our lives and unpack it as as a kind of insight into much wider dynamic patterns and structures about the very condition of modernity, the societies we inhabit, the social injustices, inequalities, and exclusions that it's premised on, but also how it frustrates, but also channels our sense of freedom and individuality in particular ways. Now, again, I'm so ever so grateful for you having joined us. Do feel free to ask any questions that you have on the live chat that we are scheduling. Thank you again, and thank you for your time. Bye-bye.